November 1st, 1755. All Saints' Day. The bells of Lisbon are still ringing for morning mass when the ground opens beneath one of the richest cities in Europe. Within 6 minutes, 3 earthquakes tear the capital of the Portuguese Empire apart. The fires come next. Then the tsunami, rolling up the Tagus River and swallowing the wharves whole. By nightfall, tens of thousands are dead, and a city that only that morning had been unloading Brazilian gold and Indian spices is a smoking ruin. In the days that follow, survival on those broken docks comes down to one object. Not gold, not muskets, not stone, wood, curved wood, hooped in iron, sealed so tightly that not a drop escapes. Barrels of fresh water hauled from ships that rode out the wave. Barrels of wine that keep the injured from drinking the fouled river. Barrels of salt cod pulled from the wreckage of warehouses, the only food that has not spoiled, every one of them shaped, fitted, and pounded together by the hands of a man whose name almost no survivor could tell you. The Cooper. You have probably never thought about him. Most people never do. And yet in 1755, and for 3,000 years before, nothing crossed an ocean. Nothing was stored through a winter. Nothing fed an army or funded an empire without passing through his workshop first. But the story does not start on that Lisbon wharf. It starts far earlier, in a cold alpine valley, with a tribe the Romans dismissed as barbarians. It runs through the wine cellars of medieval monks, the gun decks of Nelson's navy, the oil fields of Pennsylvania, and the salt-cracked fingers of teenage girls in a Scottish herring yard. It builds fortunes that reshape nations. It breaks bodies by the thousand. And then, inside a single human lifetime, it vanishes so completely that the word for the man who did it survives now mostly as a surname on a mailbox. This is the story of the Cooper, the barrel maker who quietly built the modern world and then disappeared from it. Picture a hillside in what is now Austria, somewhere around 350 BCE. The wind comes down off the Alps carrying the smell of wood smoke, and in a clearing, a Celtic craftsman is doing something the Mediterranean world will refuse to understand for another 400 years. He is bending wood with fire and water. He takes narrow planks of oak, heartwood, split along the grain, never sawn across it, and he warms them over a shallow flame until they yield. Then he draws them together with a rope and drives iron rings down the sides. What rises under his hands is not a box, not a jar, not a pot. It is a curved wooden vessel, wider in the middle than at the ends, so strong that a grown man can roll a full one across a field alone, and so tight that it will hold wine through an alpine winter without a drop of loss. He has just invented the barrel, and the empire to the south has no idea what is coming. For centuries, the Mediterranean world had moved its wine, its oil, and its grain in clay. The Greek and Roman amphora, a tall, two-handled jar with a pointed base, was elegant, cheap, and everywhere. It was also fragile, heavy, and, once emptied, essentially useless. A single sway of a cargo ship in a storm could shatter 100 of them. A rough road could split them by the mile. The Celtic cask did none of those things. It rolled, it stacked, it flexed instead of breaking. It let the wine inside actually improve as it aged against the wood. When Julius Caesar's legions pushed into Gaul in the 50s BCE, the thing that stopped his quartermasters in their tracks was not the swords of the Gauls or the war chariots. It was the barrels in their storehouses. The Romans were slow to admit they had been outdone. But by the time Pliny the Elder is writing his natural history around 77 CE, he grudgingly records it. The peoples of the Alpine provinces, he says, store their wine in wooden vessels bound with hoops. That single dry sentence is one of the earliest written traces we have of the trade. Pliny does not know it, but he is describing the technology that will outlive Rome itself, outlive the amphora by nearly 2,000 years, and become the container in which every important liquid on Earth will travel until living memory. The Celts did not just make a better jar, They made the shipping container of the ancient world, and the man who built it needed a name. In Latin, he becomes Cooperius, the one who works the cask. In Old English, centuries later, that word will bend into a single syllable and stick. Cooper. The trade has been born. Now it needs to conquer a continent. When Rome falls, most of its industries fall with it. The Cooper's does not. It goes into the monasteries. Walk into a Benedictine abbey in the Rhineland or Burgundy in the 9th or 10th century, and you will find, tucked behind the church and the scriptorium, a cellar that runs the length of the nave, cold, dim, and lined from floor to ceiling with oak. The monks are not just praying, they are making wine at industrial scale, and every drop of it sits in casks built on site by brother craftsmen who have learned the trade from a master and will teach it to a novice. Charlemagne himself, around the year 800, issues a set of estate regulations, the Caput Dalia de Villis, that quietly instructs his stewards to make sure coopers are on hand, and that no cask ever leave a royal estate lined with pitch, only with beeswax and clean wood. He is legislating the flavor of an empire, but the trade truly comes of age when it steps out of the cloister and into the medieval city. And here it becomes something people today barely remember existed, a sworn craft. By the 13th century, in London, Paris, Bruges, Nuremberg, the cooper has a guild. And a guild is not a club. A guild is a court, a school, a religious brotherhood, a price-fixing cartel, and a police force, all in one. On the 20th of July, 1298, the mayor and aldermen of London formally recognized the worshipful company of coopers, a body that will still exist, on paper, 700 years later. Its job is total control of the trade inside the city walls. It sets the price of a firkin. It decides how many apprentices a master may keep. It inspects every cask made or sold in London, and it enforces those rules with a severity we struggle to imagine now. A cooper caught making a barrel with a false bottom, a common fraud, because a false bottom cheats a buyer of wine, ale, or fish by an inch of hidden air, could be dragged before the guild court, fined, publicly shamed, and, in the worst cases, put in the stocks in Cheapside with the offending cask smashed at his feet. Repeat offenders lost their right to work in the city at all. In an age with no refrigeration and no glass bottles, cheating on a cask was not a small crime. It was theft from every table in the city. The guilds also standardized sizes with an obsession that would embarrass a modern regulator. The tun, an enormous cask holding 252 gallons, became the base unit of wine trade across Northern Europe. From it descended the pipe, the hogshead, the tierce, the barrel, the kilderkin, the firkin, each exactly half or a quarter of the one above. This is why, to this day, the size of a ship's cargo is measured in tonnage. The word comes from ton. The measure of a ship is literally counted in cooper's work. By 1500, the cooper is one of the most respected tradesmen in Europe. His mark, burned into the head of every cask, is his signature and his bond. He wears it like an artist. He does not yet know it. But the greatest age his trade will ever see is still a century away, and it is going to arrive on the deck of a wooden ship pointed west. Here is a thing they never tell you about the age of sail. The ships did not run on wind. They ran on barrels. Strip away the romance for a moment. A ship of the line in the late 18th century, Nelson's HMS Victory, launched in 1765, was not, at its heart, a warship. It was a floating warehouse with cannons attached, and every cubic inch below the waterline was crammed with casks. When Victory sailed for Trafalgar in 1805, she carried around 300 tons of them in her hold, fresh water in the largest casks, called leaguers, each holding 159 gallons, salt beef and salt pork in half hogsheads, ship's biscuits sealed away from weevils in tight-headed casks, gunpowder in copper-hooped kegs because iron might spark, rum in the small ones the sailors watched with their whole hearts. Take the barrels out of that ship, and 850 men starve inside 3 weeks. The Empire understood this. Britain understood it better than anyone else, and so the Royal Navy did something extraordinary that historians of the sea rarely mention. It became the largest single employer of coopers on the planet. During the long wars against Napoleon, from roughly 1793 to 1815, the naval dockyards at Portsmouth, Plymouth, Chatham, and Deptford employed at their peak well over 2,000 coopers between them. There were tight coopers, who made watertight casks for liquids, slack coopers, who made drier ones for dry goods like flour or apples, master coopers, who signed off every head burned with the broad arrow, the mark of the crown, and journeymen who worked 12-hour shifts turning out fresh casks by the hundred, because a fleet at sea consumed and destroyed them faster than any workshop ashore could replace them. The economics of this are staggering when you sit with them. A first-rate warship might go through several thousand casks in a single long commission, every one of them handmade, every one of them stamped and traced. The Admiralty kept ledgers, some of which still survive in the National Archives at Kew, listing coopers by name and pay. This was not a quaint craft on the side of the war effort. This was the logistical spine of it. Without the cooper, there is no blockade of France, no long patrol off Cape Trafalgar, no British Empire at all, and it was not just warships. When Captain Cook set out from Plymouth in 1768 to find the transit of Venus and, quietly, a continent, HMS Endeavour carried barrels of sauerkraut, a specifically cooper-sealed cargo, because Cook had heard the sour cabbage might fight scurvy. When Columbus crossed in 1492, when the Mayflower crossed in 1620, when the East India Company sent its first fleet to the Spice Islands in 1601, the ships all rode the same silent technology below decks: curved oak, iron hoops, a cooper's mark burned in the head. The age of sail did not open the world. The cooper did. He just never got on the ship. If wooden warships were the cooper's most famous stage, they were not his busiest. His busiest was a single, silvery fish. The North Sea herring is not a large animal. Palm of your hand, roughly. Oily, quick to spoil, worthless within a day of coming out of the water. And yet from the late Middle Ages onward, it was one of the most important commodities in Northern Europe, because if you could get it salted and sealed into a cask fast enough, it became something extraordinary. A protein that traveled, a food that could feed a Prussian army in winter, a Polish market town in Lent, a Russian peasant 1,000 miles from the sea. Herring was the industrial calorie of pre-industrial Europe, and every last one of them lived and died inside a cooper's barrel. The Dutch dominated this trade for 2 centuries, and their fortunes, the townhouses of Amsterdam, the tulip mania, the golden age of Vermeer, were funded in no small part by cured fish sealed in oak. But the story that really shows the cooper at his peak belongs a little further north, on the storm-scoured east coast of Scotland. In 1808, the British government did something quietly revolutionary. It created the Fishery Board for Scotland, and with it, a certification called the Crown Brand. A herring cask could not be shipped abroad under the King's name unless a board officer had inspected the barrel, the fish inside, and the salt, and burned a crown into the head with a hot iron. That single stamp turned a Scottish herring barrel into a guarantee, and buyers from Königsberg to Odessa learned to trust it above any other. What followed was one of the largest and most forgotten industrial booms of the 19th century. The little grey harbour towns of Wick in Caithness and Great Yarmouth in Norfolk became, for a few weeks each year, the busiest cooperages on earth. Around Wick alone, at the height of the boom in the 1860s, more than 1,000 fishing boats crowded a harbour built for a fraction of that number, and behind every boat stood a small army of coopers, hammering, shaving, and heading casks at a pace that visitors from London described as almost unbelievable. The numbers are worth pausing on. At its peak, the Scottish and East Anglian herring trade packed something in the order of 250 million herring into oak barrels every single year. Those barrels were then loaded onto ships and sent, in vast quantities, into the Baltic, to the ports of the German states that would become Prussia, to the grain cities of Poland, up the Neva into the Russian Empire. In some Prussian towns in the 1850s, a single meal in 3, during Lent, was a Scottish herring pulled from a Scottish cask, sealed by a Scottish cooper. And here is the wow buried in the ledgers. The economy of a fish that lived for a few years in the North Sea, and the economy of a Russian village a month's journey from the coast, were connected by one man in a leather apron and his hammer. Take him out of the chain, and the fish rots at the dock. The empire eats less. The Baltic goes hungrier in winter. The cooper had built a food web across a continent, and nobody outside the trade quite noticed. He was about to become something even stranger. He was about to make people rich. There is a law in the United States, still on the books, that quietly protects a trade almost nobody remembers is a trade at all. It is called the Federal Standards of Identity for Distilled Spirits, and one specific clause, codified in 1935 in the wake of the repeal of Prohibition, says this: to be legally sold as bourbon whiskey, the spirit must be aged in a new, charred oak container. New, not reused. Every batch, a fresh cask. Read that sentence again, because it is one of the most consequential regulations in American commercial history, and almost nobody outside the whiskey world can tell you it exists. That single line, written by government lawyers in Washington, guaranteed that as long as bourbon was made, and it has only grown since, someone, somewhere, would have to keep making brand new oak barrels by the 10,000, forever. The consequence is that the cooper, who by the 1930s was already an endangered species in most industries, was granted an artificial afterlife inside a bottle of whiskey. And the fortunes built on top of that afterlife are extraordinary. Trace the money back. The great Kentucky bourbon houses, Jim Beam, tracing to Jacob Beam and his first commercial barrel sold in 1795, the founding of what would become Jack Daniel's in Lynchburg, Tennessee in the 1860s, the rise of the Bushmills Distillery in County Antrim, Ireland, licensed all the way back in 1608, all of them rest on a single fact. Their spirit is not really made in the still, it is made in the cask. The distillate that comes off a copper pot is a rough, colorless alcohol. What turns it into the amber, vanilla-scented liquid people pay small fortunes for is the years it spends soaking into and out of charred American white oak. Around 60 to 70% of bourbon's final flavor, distillers themselves will tell you, comes from the wood, which means the cooperages behind these brands were, quietly, the real engines of the whiskey fortunes. The most famous of them is Bluegrass Cooperage, founded in Louisville, Kentucky, in 1912. For decades it supplied the barrels that shaped bourbon itself, a workshop where staves of white oak from Missouri and Arkansas were raised, fired over open flames until the inside charred black, hooped, and rolled out to the distilleries by the thousand. When you sip a Kentucky bourbon today, the taste in your mouth was, in a very real sense, engineered inside a cooperage before it ever reached the still. And there is a beautiful, ironic twist buried in the American law. Because bourbon barrels can only be used once, the American distillers, after emptying them, have to sell them off. Where do those used casks go? Across the Atlantic, to Scotland. Nearly every bottle of Scotch whiskey in the world today, Glenlivet, Glenfiddich, Macallan, Highland Park, is aged, at least partly, in a former bourbon barrel that started its working life in a Kentucky cooperage. The American cooper, in other words, secretly built the flavor of the Scottish whiskey industry too. One trade, two national spirits, a federal statute written in Washington, a hillside of oak in the Ozarks, and a craftsman with a chisel, standing at the very center of it and almost never named. But whiskey was not the biggest fortune the cooper would ever build. The biggest one came out of the ground, black and slick, and it was about to make the richest man in the history of the world. Here is a fact that should be famous and somehow is not. When John D. Rockefeller became the wealthiest man in modern history, he did it. At the beginning, on the back of a wooden barrel. Everybody tells the Standard Oil story the same way. pipelines, railroads, ruthless rebates. The trust, the 1911 Supreme Court breakup, Rockefeller as the cold genius of scale, all true. But the story people miss is the one that comes first. In the 1860s and 1870s, when the oil that changed the world was not moving in pipes at all, it was moving in barrels, wooden ones, made by coopers, and Rockefeller understood something none of his competitors did, that whoever controlled the barrel controlled the oil. Petroleum in the 1860s was a chaos. In western Pennsylvania at Titusville, Edwin Drake had struck oil in 1859, and within a few years a landscape of derricks was pumping crude out of the ground faster than anyone knew what to do with it. The problem was moving it. There were no pipelines yet, no tank cars worth the name. The only way to get kerosene to a lamp in Ohio, or to a wharf in New York, or across the Atlantic to a Prussian household, was to pump it into a cask, hammer the head shut, roll it onto a wagon, then a train, then a ship. And every single one of those casks came from a cooperage. At the peak, in the early 1870s, a single barrel of crude sold in Cleveland for a few dollars. The barrel it came in cost more than the oil inside. Let that sink in. The container was worth more than the contents, which meant that in a market where you could not compete on the oil itself, you could win the whole game if you owned the barrel. Rockefeller worked this out early, and it made him. Rather than buy his casks from independent workshops the way his rivals did, he built his own. By the mid-1870s, Standard Oil's cooperages in and around Cleveland were turning out, according to contemporary trade accounts, around 3,000 barrels a day, at an internal cost of roughly $2.50 each, undercutting the market rate by nearly half. He bought entire oak forests in Ohio and Indiana to feed those workshops. He built his own kilns to dry the staves. He hired coopers on staff by the hundred. And then, quietly, he refused to sell his surplus barrels to anyone else. That was the knife. A rival refiner in Pittsburgh or Philadelphia could not ship a drop of kerosene if he could not find a barrel. And thanks to Rockefeller, there were no barrels. That is how the small refiners were strangled, one after another, between roughly 1870 and 1878, and swallowed into Standard Oil, not by the pipelines that came later, but by the wooden cask that came first. The most quietly extraordinary detail is the unit itself. To this day, the world price of oil is quoted per barrel, not per ton, not per liter, per barrel, 42 US gallons, a size fixed in Pennsylvania in 1866 by a group of oilmen sitting around a table trying to standardize the trade. There has not been a real wooden oil barrel in commercial use for a century. And yet every morning, every financial newspaper on earth still prints the price of oil in the shape of a container the cooper made. His trade had built a fortune, a monopoly, and a unit of measure that outlived his craft. But the cost of building all of this was about to come due, and it would be paid in bodies. Step into a cooperage in Glasgow in the 1890s, and the first thing that hits you is the noise. Not a single hammer, 100 hammers, iron on wood, at close quarters, inside a stone-walled workshop, for 10 hours a day. There is no ear protection. There is no concept of ear protection. There is only the ringing. British factory inspectors, whose reports from the 1890s survive in the parliamentary archives, kept returning to the same observation about coopers. By middle age, most of them were partially deaf. They spoke too loudly in the pub. They cupped a hand to their ear when a foreman shouted across the yard. It was so common in the trade that in some cities it had a nickname, Cooper's Ear, and it was regarded, sadly, as simply part of the work. But the sound was only the beginning of what the trade did to a man. To understand the daily reality, you have to see the tools. The cooper worked with a set of implements, almost none of which survive in common use today, each one a hazard in its own right. There was the adze, a heavy, curved blade axe, swung between the feet to shape the outside of a stave. A slip cost you a toe, sometimes a foot. There was the crows, a specialized plane that cut the narrow groove near the top of the stave where the head of the cask would sit. A badly held crow's took fingertips. There was the howl, a curved plane that hollowed the inside of the cask, and the draw knife, and the jointer, and the flagging iron. A journeyman cooper carried scars on his hands the way a soldier carried them on his face. It was said in the Belfast yards that you could recognize an old cooper by his knuckles alone. And then there was the fire. To bend the staves into their belly curve, the cooper stood a half-formed barrel over a small open flame, the cresset, and worked it with steam and force until the wood yielded. Men worked in leather aprons that were always singed. Burns on the forearms were not injuries, they were the trade, and into all of this, at the age of 12, went a boy. The apprenticeship in a Glasgow or Belfast cooperage in the late 19th century ran for 7 years. 7. A boy signed indentures at 12 or 13, moved into a master's household or a lodging near the yard, and was paid a pittance, sometimes only bed and board for the first year, for a working week that could stretch to 60 hours. He was not permitted to marry during the apprenticeship. He could not leave the trade without a legal case. In return, at the end of it, he was granted the freedom of the guild, the right to call himself a journeyman, and, if he was lucky, the eventual right to his own workshop. For most, though, the freedom of the guild came with a body already worn out at 30. Bad hearing, ruined knees from a lifetime of stooping over a half-finished cask, chronic back injury from wrestling casks weighing 300, 400 pounds when full. The English cooper Frank Buckley, whose memoir survives from the London docks, wrote plainly that a man who did the trade for 40 years should not expect to enjoy 50. This was the price of the barrels that carried the empire's oil, the empire's whiskey, the empire's herring. And the men who paid it were the ones the ledgers never named. But they were not the only ones, because the herring barrel in particular was funded by hands that were even younger and even less remembered. Wick Harbor, August 1913. The coopers are working the cask heads on the pier, hammer ring rolling out over the water, and beside them, in a long line that runs the length of the quay, stand the women who made the whole trade possible, and whose names history has almost entirely erased. They were called the herring lassies. In Scots Gaelic, Clan Nyan and Skidane, the herring girls. And they were not a footnote to the cooperage. They were half of it. Here is how the trade actually worked, once you clear away the romance. A herring boat came into Wick, or Fraserburgh, or later Great Yarmouth, with its hold full of silver fish, and the clock started. Herring spoils in hours. It had to be gutted, sorted by size and quality, salted, and packed into a fresh oak cask before the day was out, or the entire catch was worthless. The cooper made the cask, the lassies did everything in between. And they did it faster than the human hand should reasonably be able to move. A skilled herring girl, working in a team of 3 at a wooden gutting trough. One gipper, wielding a small sharp knife called a cudog. 2 packers laying the fish into the cask in perfect concentric circles between layers of coarse salt could process, according to fishery board records from the 1880s and 1890s, roughly 60 fish a minute. 60. That is 1 gutted, sorted herring every second, sustained for 10, 12, sometimes 15 hours in a stretch during peak season. Their wages were paid by the piece, by the barrel, in fact, the cooper's barrel, which meant they never stopped. The salt did to them what the hammer did to the cooper. The brine and the salt of the trough cracked their hands open within days of the season starting. Every night, on the docks of Yarmouth and the boarding houses of Wick, the girls would sit and bind their fingers in strips of cotton torn from old shirts. Cloudy rags, they called them, soaked in salve, because raw salt on raw flesh was unendurable. Photographs survive from the early 1900s, held now in the collection of the Wick Society and the Time and Tide Museum in Great Yarmouth, of their hands. You cannot look at them for long. Split skin, blackened fingernails, fingers already curled at 20 from the cold and the cutag, and they followed the fish. This is the part almost nobody knows. The herring migrate south down the North Sea coast through the summer and autumn, and the girls migrated with them from Shetland and Lewis in June to the Scottish east coast in July and August, down to Grimsby and Great Yarmouth by September and October. Whole seasons of the year, they lived in barrack-like curers' huts by the harbor, 3 to a bed, singing Gaelic walking songs across a language line most of Yarmouth could not understand. It was one of the largest annual migrations of women workers in British history, and it has been almost entirely written out of the story. In 1913, at Great Yarmouth, they struck. The scandal that came out in the local press was that some girls, working from dawn to well past dark, were earning, after deductions for their salt and their lodging, only a shilling or two for a day of processing thousands of fish. The strike partially succeeded, but most of the girls and most of the coopers never lived to see their trade properly remembered, and by the time anyone thought to write it down, the machine that would kill both of them was already on the drawing board. Sometimes an entire way of life ends because of a single accident in a print shop. Brooklyn, 1890. Robert Gare, a Scottish-born printer who runs a paper bag factory in New York, watches a metal ruler slip on one of his cutting presses. Instead of scoring a sheet of paperboard cleanly, the misaligned ruler slices right through it. Gare does not curse. He stares. He has just realized that if you could set a press to score and cut at the same time, in one pass, you could mass produce a flat piece of card that could be folded up, on the spot, into a box. Cheap, light, disposable, stackable. He patents the pre-cut, pre-scored cardboard box the same year. And within 2 decades, that invention starts eating the cooper alive. The cardboard box did not immediately replace the barrel. It did not have to. It simply took over, one commodity at a time, the vast middle of the market that the cooper had quietly owned for centuries. Flour, once shipped in slack casks, moved to sacks and cartons. Apples, dry goods, hardware, biscuits, soap. A grocery store in 1880 was walled in barrels. A grocery store in 1920 was walled in cardboard. The tight cooper who made watertight casks was safe for a little longer, because cardboard could not hold liquids. But the slack cooper, the dry goods cooper, half the trade, was finished before the First World War ended. Then came the second killer, and it went straight for the tight cooper's last stronghold. In 1905, a New Yorker named Elizabeth Cochran, better known to the world by her journalist's pen name, Nellie Bly, the reporter who had gone around the world in 72 days, inherited her late husband's factory, the Ironclad Manufacturing Company. She was not content to run it. She wanted to invent inside it. And in 1905, she filed the patent for a mass-producible steel oil drum, a stackable 55-gallon container made of rolled sheet steel with rolling hoops pressed into the sides. It is one of the great forgotten industrial patents of the modern age, because the steel drum did to the tight cooper what the cardboard box did to the slack one, only faster, and in a market that mattered more. Oil, chemicals, solvents, industrial fluids of every kind began moving in steel. By the 1920s, Standard Oil's successors and every other petroleum company on Earth were quietly retiring their wooden barrels. The interwar years were a bloodbath for cooperages. Workshops that had stood for 2 centuries in Liverpool, in Hamburg, in Marseille, in Cleveland, closed their doors between roughly 1919 and 1939. And then, after the Second World War, came the final blow. The shipping container, a steel box, standardized in the 1950s and rolled out globally through the 1960s, that turned every wharf on Earth into a place where cranes lifted metal, not casks. The port of Wick, once thundering with hammers, went silent. Great Yarmouth's herring yards became car parks. A craft that had crossed oceans for 2,000 years disappeared from most of the world's harbors in about 40. There was no single day when it ended. There was only the year when the last cooper on your street closed his workshop, and the year after that, when nobody knew what the empty building had been. The end, when it came, had a particular sound, It was the sound of a workshop being cleared, tools being wrapped, one by one, in oiled cloth, adzes and crowses and howls laid into wooden chests by men who understood, correctly, that no one was coming to take up the trade behind them. The date that finally broke the cooper's back in Britain is quiet and specific. Between roughly 1955 and 1961, the great Scottish herring cooperages that had employed thousands only a generation earlier were shut down or reduced to skeleton crews. The herring itself was collapsing. Decades of overfishing had gutted the North Sea stocks, and the trade around it went down with the fish. In Wick, in Fraserburgh, in Peterhead, the yards closed. The lassies had already scattered years before. The coopers put their tools in the shed and looked for work in the shipyards, or the distilleries, or emigrated. What remained, by the 1970s, was a rump. Two industries in the entire English-speaking world still needed the cooper, and only two: whiskey and wine. The Scotch whiskey industry had never stopped needing casks. Every drop of it, by law, must be aged in oak for a minimum of 3 years, and the wine trade in France, Spain, and California still preferred oak for its finer bottles. So a handful of cooperages, mostly attached to major distilleries, survived. Speyside Cooperage in Craigellachie, founded in 1947, quietly became one of the last serious workshops of its kind in Britain. In Kentucky, Independent Stave Company and a few others kept going, because American law would not let bourbon exist without them. In France, the great oak cooperages of the Limousin and the Allier, feeding the chateaux of Bordeaux and Burgundy, kept a version of the medieval trade alive by the thinnest of threads. But the numbers tell the truth. In the early 1900s, Britain likely employed something on the order of tens of thousands of working coopers across all industries. By the 1970s, a few thousand. By the year 2000, a few hundred. Recent industry estimates suggest that today, fewer than 200 full-time working coopers remain in the United Kingdom, and the overwhelming majority of them work for a single sector: Scotch whiskey, repairing and remaking casks for distilleries like the Macallan, Glenfiddich, and Highland Park. Their apprenticeships, once 7 years long and served in an urban guild, are now 4-year in-house programs offered by individual distilleries. The Worshipful Company of Coopers in London, that same body founded in 1298, still exists, but as a livery company, a charitable and ceremonial institution, not a working trade. There is a small ritual, still performed, at Speyside Cooperage when an apprentice completes his indentures. They call it the Black Bulling. The other coopers dunk him headfirst into a barrel filled with soot, shavings, water, and yeast. He climbs out laughing, or spluttering, or both. It is one of the last living echoes of a guild ceremony that would have been recognizable to a 14th century Londoner. Everywhere else the trade is gone. Not fading, gone. A workshop that ran without interruption from Iron Age Austria to Cold War Britain, some 2,500 years, closed its doors, effectively, within one human lifetime. And you have never really noticed. Which is the strangest part of all. Because his ghost is still standing next to you. Let us gather it up, all of it, before we let it go. Iron Age tribes in the Alps bending oak with fire, 3 centuries before Christ. Roman generals grudgingly admitting the barbarians have built a better jar. Benedictine monks lining their cellars with silent walls of wood. A London guild in 1298 dragging cheating craftsmen to the stocks over a false-bottomed cask. Every ship of Nelson's navy sailing on 300 tons of the cooper's work. 2,000 naval coopers hammering at Portsmouth through the Napoleonic Wars. 250 million herring a year sealed into Scottish oak and shipped east to feed a Baltic empire. John D. Rockefeller strangling his rivals not with pipelines, but with barrels. A federal law in Washington in 1935 that still, right now, this minute, forces someone in Kentucky to char a fresh oak cask before your bourbon is legal to sell. 12-year-old apprentices in Glasgow going deaf by 40. Girls from the Isle of Lewis, with their fingers bound in cloth, gutting a fish a second on the docks of Great Yarmouth. And then, in the space of 40 years, all of it gone, or almost gone. Because here is where the story stops being history and becomes something quieter and stranger and much closer to you than you realized. Take a moment and look around the room you are in. The odds are that the Cooper is in it with you, and you have never seen him. He is in the name on the mailbox. Cooper is one of the 5 most common occupational surnames in the English language. Every Cooper on earth, Bradley Cooper, Alice Cooper, the family down the street, carries in their name a great-great-great-grandfather who bent staves for a living. There are Coopers in America, Coopers in Australia, Coopers in South Africa, all descended from a European workshop long since torn down. He is in the street signs: Cooperage Lane in Bristol, Cooper Street in Manchester, Cooper Square in New York, Cooperage Row in Boston. Little slivers of a vanished industrial map still stamped into the cities. He is in the language: barrel-chested, over a barrel, barrel of laughs. The word tonnage, the measure of every ship afloat, comes from his ton. When a financial news anchor tells you that oil closed at $80 a barrel, she is quoting a container that has not existed in the trade for 100 years. The unit outlived the object. He is in the whiskey in the cabinet. Every single bottle of scotch, every single bottle of bourbon, still passes through his craft. That is not marketing. That is law and chemistry. Without the Cooper, those drinks do not exist, and he is on the Lisbon wharf where we began. When the earth split in 1755 and a city was drowning and burning at the same time, the thing that kept its survivors alive was the water and the wine and the salt cod inside intact wooden casks. Anonymous work, signed only with a burn mark on a barrel head, in a warehouse that no longer stands. For 3,000 years, this man held the world together. Then, in one lifetime, he vanished. And most of us go through an entire day now surrounded by his ghost, in a name, in a street, in a bottle, in a unit of oil, without ever knowing he was there. If any part of that surprised you, the false bottoms in Cheapside, the herring girls in Yarmouth, Rockefeller's Cleveland cooperages, the law in Washington, subscribe and stay with us. And I would like to ask you a question in the comments. Was there a Cooper in your own family tree? A grandfather, a great-uncle, a name in an old parish register? Or was it another lost trade, a blacksmith, a wheelwright, a lamplighter, a linotype operator whose story deserves to come back? Tell us. This channel exists for one reason: to find the forgotten trades and the lost worlds behind the everyday things you have stopped noticing, and to give them their names back.